part of the Bretton Woods institutions after the Second World War, and basically they are institutions which were set up to maintain an imperialist outcome.
The World Bank was actually seen as something which would give loans to build up infrastructure and economies and so on, rather than what they became, which were loans at high levels of interest, which then became an incredible burden to most debtor nations. And the IMF was supposed to keep the monetary system sort of functioning, so that the monetary system that was around the world, that tied the sort of world together into these kind of trade and other sorts of financial relationships, was supposed to be regulated and overseen by the IMF.
The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank are loan-providing multilateral organisations which are run by their shareholder countries, in particular the biggest countries, the US, countries in Europe. They lend money to nearly in all cases third world governments, either for what the World Bank dubs development, which in many cases has meant things like dam building, or for solving fiscal or currency crisis in the case of the IMF. The conditions for that are that the countries which take out these loans follow what are dubbed structural adjustment plans, which is that they restructure their economies in favour of allowing more Western investment, and that they restructure their government priorities and policies and tax rules and all sorts of things in the interests of business and away from social equity.
They were majorly set up by the United States to actually sort of liberalise trade and to specifically give access to markets to which the United States had no access. And so if you look at that and you see where the United States' globalising agenda has gone since then, in fact it's followed that logic.
International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organisation have been set up for the transnational corporations to be able to lobby to change laws, to get governments to change laws, to maximise their profits and to minimise any resistance from organisations such as trade unions. So they're not there to the benefit of the vast majority of working people.
It's very rare for a government to refuse to implement an IMF programme. And there's a very good reason for that, because they get punished, not by the IMF, they get punished by the international capitalist system, they get punished by the international financiers, by the transnational corporations, etc., who leave, who no longer invest in that country, who take their assets out of that country.
The IMF's poverty reduction strategy paper for Tanzania included 157 specific changes to the country's laws and regulations, all designed to suit Western corporations.
These are the major institutions to which third world countries owe debt. So these two institutions hold the largest part of the third world debt.
A lot of money was lent to third world countries, and a lot of the rhetoric was about development. These were developing countries, that's the way we talked about them. But that rhetoric was a lie, basically, because these countries are not developing. In fact, they're going backwards. And when the post-World War boom collapsed and the economic crisis started to hit, and that they started to actually call on these countries to pay back their debts, you found that you get whole continents which end up being basket cases. Like people talk about the basket case of the Africa.
What happened after the economic crisis of the 1970s was that their role became much more strikingly financial police for the imperialist powers because of the debt.
At the moment, of the 160 or so states around the world, that 100 of them are under the administration of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And what that means is that those countries have at one stage or another gone to the World Bank or IMF and asked for loans. They basically found themselves in danger of bankruptcy, and as a condition of that have been required to implement a whole raft of policies. One example, for instance, is 1998. Suharto had to finally remove subsidies on fuel as part of Indonesia's agreement with the IMF, and that sparked a whole series of uprisings in Indonesia, in particular, of course, the riots in Jakarta, which was the immediate spark that led to his downfall. These interventions by international financial institutions in the affairs of states, in terms of shaping policies of states, are absolutely crucial.
Part of the role that the IMF and the WTO play is actually about making sure that in those third world countries that they allow manufacturing to happen on the basis of having free trade zones which allow corporations to set up business without any tax going back into those local communities. Having also in those zones restrictions on the workers' rights to organise and unions' rights to exist and represent them. So it really is a matter of saying, well, we will provide this assistance to you as a country if the deal is that you open your borders to global capital.
This whole system is actually not allowing those countries to develop. It's not allowing them to industrialise. It's not allowing them to catch up with the West, because the dice is always loaded so that the first world countries always come out ahead.
Three men, Bill Gates, Paul Allen and Warren Buffett, now own assets equivalent to those owned by 600 million people living in the world's 48 least developed countries.
There are examples where some of the big water corporations like Vivendi have worked very closely with the IMF in terms of making water privatisation one of the conditions of structural adjustment and getting loans.
There are many instances where World Trade Organization agreements have been first drafted by business institutions like the International Chamber of Commerce. And in the case of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, they have long established practices of going to Western investors and asking for their views on what exactly should be the mix of packages which are put in these structural adjustment plans.
Those institutions are part of creating a climate internationally that allows multinational corporations and transnational corporations to be able to move unfettered throughout the world.
48 of the wealthiest and most powerful institutions are now corporations rather than governments. They control 70% of the world's trade and 80% of the world's foreign investment.
20 years ago, the IMF was certainly the most important institution in terms of the international economy. Now, I think it's probably, I would say the World Trade Organization is much more powerful.
The World Trade Organization was set up in 1995 out of a long process of negotiations on free trade called GATT, as both a body to incorporate ongoing trade negotiations but also to enforce trade laws.
Every single disputes panel that has been held has ruled against government regulation and in favour of free trade, in favour of the market. Environmental legislation, health legislation has been struck down by the disputes panel. So governments have been forced to get rid of environmental legislation because it's seen as a barrier to trade.
You can already see what's happening to public education in Australia, for example. You can see what's happening to public health. I mean, you can see it in prisons. When I first came here, I couldn't imagine that a prison could be run for profit. To me, a prison was either for rehabilitation, so that you don't run it. In fact, you put money into to try and get these people to go out and lead a sort of more kind of creative life. But when now you actually look at prisons run for profit.
If you look at the General Agreement on Trade in Services, which is the next major thing that's going to be up for discussion at the World Trade Organization. Now that agreement is all about opening up public services to marketisation and to, saying that public services should compete with private corporations in the provision of health and education and water and all that sort of stuff. Well, the Liberal government is actually pushing for those sorts of things. Within the World Trade Organization, they are for stricter WTO rules in terms of, what can be publicly run and how. And then you look at what they're actually doing. They're cutting funding to public education and handing millions of dollars to elite private schools. They are handing billions of dollars to private health insurance companies. They have slashed funding on the universities, which is opening up the door to corporatisation of our universities. So, to some extent, they're actually already doing it.
Whether you should stay 2 days in hospital or 5 days in hospital is going to be dictated to by your insurance company. So, basically, unless you have the money